Hello and welcome to part 3 of my Holbein painting investigation. Now in this part we're actually going to start finally painting, and this is going to be quite sort of new territory for me because I've been looking at some of these painting techniques and I haven't really tried them out before. Now I've been getting most of my information from as to how Holbein painted his pictures from this book here, which I mentioned in episode 1. Now this book has a section on Old Master techniques, and there's a section that goes into sort of the Flemish or sort of Northern Renaissance style, which was invented by Jan van Eyck, and I believe that it was this style invented by Jan van Eyck, which Holbein used for his paintings. He probably made a few changes, which we'll get into later, but this book sets down sort of the various stages and techniques which Van Eyck used to paint his pictures. Now in the book there is a sort of list of stages which you should follow to recreate Jan van Eyck's style, and the first 2 stages we've already done, which is prepare the gesso board and transfer the drawing. Now I'm just going to read the 3rd stage from the book. Number 3. The imprimatura made with an oil colour containing a little red or yellow ochre in ethereal varnish. All superfluous glaze would be removed with a rag. The imprimatura should be lean and barely show a gloss. It should have a texture like toned paper, and the outline drawing underneath should remain visible through it. Okay, so the imprimatura, it's an Italian word. It basically just means the first layer of paint, and it should be a sort of very thin sort of toning glaze. So the white of the tempera should still be visible, but it'll be sort of stained by the colour of the whatever colour you choose for your imprimatura. They're normally earth colours, like a sort of raw sienna or yellow ochre. It also mentions here that the oil colour, whichever one you choose, should be mixed with this ethereal varnish. Now I think in ethereal varnish, when he says ethereal varnish, it's referencing either a mastic varnish or a damar varnish. I don't actually have any mastic with me, but I do have damar. So what I'm going to do is make a damar based ethereal varnish, and I'll show you how you can make one as well. So the ingredients I'll need are some balsam turpentine and some damar crystals, which I've crushed into a fine powder. Now the mixing ratio is 1 part damar crystals to 3 parts turpentine. So what I'm doing here is just measuring out 180 milliliters of turpentine. Now I want to pour the turpentine into a large jar. This is like a ½ liter jar, and it has to have a sort of wide neck which I can put a cover over. So now I'm measuring out 60 milliliters of the damar crystals, and what I want to do is just slightly heat up the damar crystals to get rid of any residual moisture. So I'm just putting on a hot plate and heating up to about 50 degrees Celsius until it's sort of quite warm to the touch. And then I want to get the crystals and pour it out on 2 sheets of cheesecloth stacked on top of each other. You might also have to scratch the bottom of where you heated the crystals, because they sometimes stick if you heat it up too much. So here I'm just bundling the damar crystals into a ball, and I just want to get either some string, or here I'm just using some copper wire, and I want to just bind up the crystals in a sort of little ball or sort of satchel. So I've got my little bundle of crystals, and what I want to do is just submerge it an inch deep into the turpentine, and what I'm doing is using the lid as well to sort of hold the little bundle in place. So I want to leave that about 8 hours or overnight, and when I come back, you'll find that most of the crystals have all melted, and you just want to give the little bundle a squeeze just to get any residual turpentine out, and then basically just unwrap it, and you'll see that on the cheesecloth all the sort of impurities have been left behind. And that is how you make damar ethereal varnish. Now, before I start doing the imprimatura, I just want to test out some mixes of paint and the varnish I've just made. So for this, I'm just mixing about 1 part of yellow ochre oil paint with 1 part of the varnish. And on this, I'm mixing about 2 parts varnish to 1 part yellow ochre oil paint. And on the third, it's 3 parts varnish to 1 part oil paint. And on the fourth, I mixed up about 2 parts oil paint to 1 part varnish. Now I'm doing this because I want to see how glossy the various ratios are, because as the instructions say, the imprimatura shouldn't be too glossy. What I'm doing here now is just flattening out some of the brush strokes with a softer brush. Now here I'm actually getting rid of the superfluous glaze with a rag. So this is where I want most of the highlights to be. I just rub away the imprimatura so as to reveal the white gesso underneath. So this is like a day later, and I'm just checking up the results. And what I'm looking for is just sort of like in the instructions said, I want to be barely glossy. Now I found the two on the left with the higher varnish ratios were just a bit too glossy for my liking, and the bottom right was just a bit too dull. So in the end, I ended up deciding to go with these the top right mix, which was a sort of 1-to-1 paint and varnish ratio. So now I know my ratio, it's time to apply the imprimatura over the drawing. Oh, well, that's not supposed to happen. It appears that the ink is smudging when I'm applying the paint. Hold on, I have to figure what's going wrong here. So basically what went wrong was that when I transferred the drawing onto the board using this sort of carbon paper, it meant that I'd left these sort of these lines of carbon on the board, which I then traced over in ink. Now what happened was basically the ink trapped some charcoal underneath the lines, meaning it probably didn't adhere to the board as well as it should have. So When I then applied the sort of damal varnish with the oil paint, it sort of reactivated the charcoal underneath, and also sort of dislodged all the ink as well, which had not adhered to the board. So what I did was just wipe down the board with a whole bunch of turpentine and white spirit, basically until all the lines stopped smudging. It also faded the lines quite a lot, so I had to sort of retrace the lines with Indian ink, but hopefully that should work. Right, here we go, round 2. Phew, no smudging. Now I decided to go with a yellow ochre for the colour of the imprimatura. I think you can also do different earth tones if you like, but I think the important thing is that you have a bit of ochre colour in the mix, because the ochre pigment is quite gritty, and it helps subsequent layers of paint stick to it better. And here again I'm just wiping off some of the glaze in the sort of highlight areas of the flesh. This is again to sort of utilise the whiteness and the brightness of the gesso underneath. So I'm just doing it in the areas where the skin is lightest. Now I haven't yet decided on what colour the background will be, but I want it to be quite bright, so hence I'm taking off some of the glaze in the background area to expose some of the gesso underneath a little bit more. Okay, so that is the imprimatura layer done. Now it's time to add highlights in tempera paint. Now before we do that, I thought I'd first just show you how I'll make a tempura medium. Now I'm using a traditional recipe here. Now to make that I need a whole egg, some stand oil, some distilled water, and a couple of vessels. One should have a lid as well. Oh, and a palette knife. So you just want to break the egg into a measuring jar here. And then you just want to whisk up the egg. So once that's whisked, you just want to take note of how much egg is in the measuring jar. So here it's about 50 milliliters. And then I just want to pour the mixed egg into the jar. Now just give the measuring cup a little clean, and then I just want to pour out 50 milliliters of stand oil. Then I just want to pour the stand oil into the jar with the egg. If you don't have any stand oil, linseed oil works as well, or sun-thickened linseed oil. Now I just want to cover the jar and just give it a really good shake for about 30 seconds. Now, this is going to emulsify the oil with the egg. So now I just want to pour out 50 milliliters of distilled water, add it to the jar, and then give it another good shake for about 30 seconds. And that will give you egg tempura medium. Now making the tempera paint is very easy. You just need your medium, your pigment of choice, and some distilled water. Now I take my pigment, which in this case is zinc white, and I just get a dollop of it on my palette knife, and then I just plonk it down on the palette. Now I pre-ground this pigment with some distilled water, so that's why it's quite smooth. But you don't have to do this, you can just use it straight from the jar if you want. Now get your egg tempera and just pour a little bit of the tempera over the pigment, and then just get your palette knife and just mix it all together. Now the tempera can also be diluted further by just adding more distilled water to the mix. Now once you're happy with the mixture, you just want to push it all together into a pile so that it doesn't dry as quickly. And there you have some white tempera paint. So now we have our white tempera paint ready, we want to start applying it to the painting. Now the whole idea of this part of the painting is that you want to slowly build up the highlights by applying sort of lots of thin layers of tempera paint over the top of each other. Now because we're working with tempera, the paint will dry relatively quickly. This is the theory anyway. I'm using zinc white as my pigment, and zinc white isn't the best dryer. Lead white would be the best, but I just don't have any. So I'm just going to work with zinc white and just see how it goes. So the more I continued with the painting, the more I found that the zinc white mixed with the traditional Tempura Medium was drying quite a lot slower than I thought it would. I found that after like a few hours, the tempera paint was, if not sort of wet, it was still quite greasy. And when I tried to paint the subsequent layer over it, it was still wet enough so that my brush would start moving around the previous layer and it would all start to clog up with the layer that I was just painting. It really wasn't that nice. So what I decided to do was do some research and see if I could find a better alternative to the zinc white pigment. So after doing some research, I basically found out that really the best white that would be working with the Tempura Medium would be lead white or Kremnitz white, but that's quite hard to get your hands on, seeing as it's quite poisonous. So what I got instead was this thing called Kramer White or Kramer White. It's made by the pigment company Kramer, and it's said to be a sort of non-poisonous alternative to lead white. So I've done some tests already, so the top circle I've painted in Kramer White, and the bottom I've painted half with zinc and half with Kramer White. Now I can tell you that the Kramer White definitely dries quicker than the zinc white. But what you can also see as well is that the Kramer White really isn't as brilliant a white as, say, the zinc white. It's more of a light grey really than a white. Anyway, I think the best thing to do is just use the Kramer White to paint most of the highlights, but then just use the zinc white at the very end just to really accentuate the highlights. So I've painted as much as I can with the Kramer White, and I've just let that dry for a little bit. And now what I'm doing is going over the Kramer White with some zinc white. And I'm doing this in very sort of thin, sort of hatching lines, rather than sort of large areas of paint. This is recommended a style of painting when you're doing the skin. And you want to be using sort of broader brush strokes if you're painting, say, the background or the clothing. Now I want to give the background a rather distinctive texture. So what I'm doing is just sort of sponging on the tempera paint rather than brushing it on, to give it a sort of rougher looking texture. Now, as a final part of the tempera painting layer, I'm just adding some hints of chrome oxide green paint to the darker areas of the flesh. This will help later with the skin tones when I start applying more colours over it. So after all that is the tempera underpainting complete. Okay, so that's the tempera now dry, and I'm now ready to move on to using oil paints. That will be in the next video. Now I thought I'd just finish this video on my thoughts on this sort of tempera layer, and maybe how I would have maybe done things a little bit differently. Now my main difficulties with this tempera sort of layer was basically trying to find the right white pigment. I started off by using zinc white mixed with the Tempura Medium, and it was just quite frustrating because it just wasn't really drying fast enough. Really, I should be using lead white or Kremnitz white. It's just really hard to get your hands on it because it's sort of poisonous, and I think a lot of companies only sell it to sort of certified picture restorers. But I don't know, I'd like to look into that more and see if I could get my hands on it, my hands on some lead white, and because I'd like to make a comparison really between the various whites when working with Tempura Medium, because I think Holbein definitely would have used lead white. I think nearly all artists were using lead white at that time. I think, well, a titanium white is a pretty modern invention. I think it came around in the sort of 30s, and zinc white came around in the sort of 1850s. I'm not quite sure, but I think, yeah, so I think most artists before the 1850s were using lead white. I'd also just like to mention quickly as well that I think because I was using a traditional tempera emulsion, which has quite a sort of high oil content, that was maybe a factor as to why the tempera was taking longer to dry. I use a sort of other sort of pre-made tempera medium as well, and that tends to dry a lot quicker. There's probably some chemicals or something in there that makes it dry quicker that I'm not aware of. But because I'm trying to use traditional techniques and stuff that Holbein might have used, I used the traditional Tempura Medium. So I guess in conclusion, I would say the traditional Tempura Medium would work better with the lead white pigment, because I think lead white does dry quicker, apparently, and maybe that would sort of speed up the whole drying process. So yeah, maybe one day I'll be able to work with some lead white, but we'll see. And I'll definitely make a video on it if I can get my hands on it. Well, anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to be working with some oil paints. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.